Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. My name is Kristen Stevenson. I'm the Vice President of Public Policy and Advocacy for the Muscular Dystrophy Association. And thank you to everyone who's tuning in today to join us for this discussion. And I'd like to take a moment to thank our guests for traveling here today to be with us at our office in Washington, D.C., so we can talk a little bit about accessible air travel today and also in the future. We're fortunate to have representatives with us today from Southwest Airlines, Alaska Airlines, and Airlines for America. And I'm just going to go around the room and let everyone introduce themselves and say a few words about their role.
Hi, I'm Dallas Thomas. I'm the Manager of Customer Advocacy at Southwest Airlines, and my role is to really just that, be an advocate for our customers, be it customers with disabilities or just consumers in general. So in my role, I get to work a lot with our customers with disabilities and making sure that we're doing all the right things and advancing accessibility with our carrier.
Hi, I'm Ray Prentice from Alaska Airlines, and I'm the Director of Customer Advocacy. And I have a similar role to Dallas's. I'm out there advocating for all customers, and in particular advocating for customers with disabilities. And we do that through a variety of ways that we'll discuss throughout the course of the webinar today.
Hi, I'm Doug Mullen. I'm an attorney with Airlines for America. And I'm extremely lucky because I get to work with guys like Ray and Dallas here. We have a committee that pulls together all the airline customer service representatives to help coordinate and share best practices to accommodate passengers with disabilities.
And I'm Jennifer Tripp. I am a Senior Associate of Policy and Advocacy at NDA, working alongside Kristen Stevenson.
So from an administrative standpoint, and thank you everyone for introducing yourselves, from an administrative standpoint, for those of you who are tuning into the webinar, if you would like to submit a question, please do so through the chat feature on the webinar. That way we can make sure that we are able to see all of the questions as they're coming in. So let me just give you a very quick kind of overview of why NDA is engaged in accessible air travel and why it's important to us. A lot of you tuning in probably also feel passionate about access to air travel, which is why you're joining us today. And over the last 2 years, access to air travel has been one of NDA's public policy priorities. And there are a lot of reasons for that, but what it really kind of distills down to is that having access to air travel is really critical to being able to live unlimited. So the ability to have the job you want to have, go to school where you want to go to school, maintain relationships with family and friends in different places, and also being able to see a specialty provider or participate in a clinical trial that's far away from home. Those are all things that really require access to air travel to be able to realize. And NDA is committed to pursuing a collaborative approach in the air travel space, and that's what we have been doing all along and are very happy to be continuing with today, having this webinar and opening up the conversation with our partners and colleagues at the airlines to talk specifically about some of the things that they're doing in this space as well. We're committed to a collaborative approach for all stakeholders. So we're working with industry, with policymakers, both in administrative and legislative capacities, working with other advocates, and also working with other organizations who are very invested in accessible air travel. So when we're thinking about how we can help maximize air travel today, you can think about a couple of different approaches that we'll be talking about. And NDA is really working on this initiative in parallel tracks. So looking at how we can maximize access today, but then also at the same time looking at what are opportunities going forward to increase access to air travel. One of the ways that we're trying to help increase access today is by sharing information on our Resource Center landing page on our website. So you can go to NDA's Accessible Air Travel Resource Center and find a lot of information and resources. This webinar will be recorded and posted there. In addition, landing pages for the major airlines so that you can just click on that and go directly to their website landing page that is dedicated to helping individuals traveling with disabilities find the information that they need and get access to the resources that will be helpful in planning and executing their travel. So in an effort to understand what the needs of the neuromuscular disease community are, specifically around access to air travel, NDA embarked at the end of 2016 on putting forward a community survey. And more than 2,000 individuals with disabilities answered that survey and gave us a lot of really interesting information that helped us understand where the need is and where the challenges are for the neuromuscular disease community in accessing air travel. And what we found were that there were a lot of challenges that could be addressed in part with having additional information and access to information. And so part of what we're trying to do with this webinar series is to make sure that we are providing an opportunity for the community to have access to information and access to resources to help make air travel more smooth. So today's webinar is really focusing on the role of carriers, so air carriers, airlines such as Southwest Airlines and Alaska Airlines and others, and helping move forward access to air travel and helping make sure that passengers have the information that they need. So what we do today is not give you a formal kind of PowerPoint presentation, and this is just briefly what you can see is the header for the air travel survey results, which can also be found on our Accessible Air Travel landing page. What we really wanted to do today was have a conversation, kind of a roundtable discussion with the folks who are here in the room, kind of talking about questions and answers that will really kind of help get to the heart of what is available to help make air travel more smooth for passengers with disabilities and where are the opportunities in the future to improve even more upon that. And so we're going to have the first 45 minutes being a roundtable discussion format, and then the last 15 minutes will be a question and answer session. Thank you to those of you who submitted questions in advance. We got some really good questions that some have been incorporated into the content already, and then others we will be addressing in the Q&A. And again, welcome anyone and everyone out there who has questions to please submit them through the chat function so we can make sure and address all of your queries. So with that, I want to go ahead and just get us started here. I know everyone's anxious to hear what you all have to say. So we have a lot of information to cover today, and again, I'd like to thank you for being here to share your insights and for your collaboration with MDA and the disability community at large on accessible air travel. And I realize that air carriers and your airline specifically for Southwest and Alaska who are here with us today have been very engaged in access to air travel, and I'm glad we have the opportunity to share with the community some more about what those efforts look like specifically and to look into how greater access is being explored for future air travel. So having said that, I want to start out with a discussion addressing air travel in its current state and take a moment at the outset to talk about what in our previous conversations you referred to as the travel cycle and kind of what role the carriers and passengers play in that cycle. And turn it over to you.
This is Ray. My first thought, if you're looking at the travel cycle, I think we discussed that as probably pre-travel as you're making plans for your trip, deciding where you want to go, who you want to fly with, and what kind of policies might be out there. The next step would be at the airport, would be mid-trip, checking in, going through security, getting out to the gate and getting on the plane. And finally would be post-travel, which would be after you've completed travel, if you have any feedback or questions or concerns. So I maybe just touch base on the pre-travel piece of that. And I think probably the top recommendation that I would have, or I think we would share, would be that as much planning in advance you can do in terms of researching your trip. The carriers spend a lot of time putting information on the website, and we have to do that in collaboration with the disability community to provide information that would be helpful as you're making plans. So there would be information on power chair acceptance, the size of our cargo pit, the maximum weight of a chair, the type of information or resources you'd have throughout the travel cycle. So it's all there, and I think the big ask that I think we would have would be to go ahead and go to the websites for the carrier that you're going to be traveling with and look. I think at Southwest and Alaska we have tips, we have tricks, we have information, we have videos, we have the types of things that we have been told by our guests that it's helpful. So that would be the first thing. Research what you need. And then the second piece would be communicate the specific information you need to fly successfully. And we would call that a special service request. And so you'll hear Dallas and I every once in a while talking about airline lingo. And it would help if you can help us at times that you understand what we're asking for. And when you're traveling, those terms sometimes are very helpful. So we'll call those out during the course of this conversation, what kind of those key terms would be. The first one I would call would be a special service request. So are you going to need help getting through the airport? Are you going to be traveling with your power chair? Are you traveling with a scooter? Are you going to need assistance with an aisle chair getting on board the airplane and into a seat and off the seat? Will you be requiring an onboard wheelchair that we would provide during flight? There's special service requests for each one of those services. And if you're booking through a travel agent, you may need to communicate that through them, and that gets communicated to us. If you're booking directly through the carrier website, most websites, you have the capability to electronically add that special service request during the booking path, or in some cases, you may call in during the booking to a reservation center or after you've ticketed and you want to convey your exact needs that you have. Share your needs with us. That's the most important thing that I would suggest. Dallas, do you have anything else?
Yeah, when we were preparing for today, one of the things that we talked about were kind of our top 3 ideas of what would make the travel cycle more smooth. And if I could, I would say communicate, communicate, communicate. So the top 3 are all communicate. But really, that is the sort of the magic in ensuring that you do have a smooth travel experience is communicating your needs and communicating with us. So like Ray was saying, you know, when you're adding that service request to a reservation, maybe your situation is a little bit different than what we've already laid out for you on our website, and you have some particular questions. You know, it's really good practice not to wait until you get to the airport, day of travel, so you're not caught by surprise. Go ahead and give us a call. You know, we have folks, our complaint resolution officials that are received more training and disability accommodation. Help you answer those really kind of what-if questions.
And so I think that's a really interesting point about the visiting your website specifically, because we know from the survey that we conducted that from the respondents who engaged in the survey, fewer than half of them had gone to the air carrier's dedicated site to look and see what information is there. So it sounds like from your perspective, it's more than just generic information. It actually will help them get to the right people to share that information and to communicate with them about what their needs will be when they're traveling.
Yeah, and one basic piece that I would probably add to this is we're trying to provide inclusive products and services as much as we can, and one of the most inclusive things we have is the contact information for you. So a cell phone and an email address. And so there are ways that you can get trip notifications if the flight's delayed or canceled or for anything that's not going as planned. So I would just encourage everybody who flies to provide that contact information for us so we can text you or we can email you and let you know what's going on.
So you brought up something also interesting that we hear a lot about in conversations within the community about traveling with a disability, and kind of this idea of advance notice or advance notification of what the needs are. And Dallas, I heard you say communicate, communicate, communicate. And so one thing I think that is worth touching on is what are your thoughts on the idea that kind of an air carrier should be prepared to address a passenger as they arrive. So in other words, someone with a disability shouldn't necessarily need to give advance notice, and that carriers should just simply be equipped and prepared to deal with every passenger that comes as they come. I'm assuming that there is some rationale for the advance notice, but would be interested in hearing your thoughts on that kind of as a perspective.
Sure. Well, it certainly helps us just from a staffing perspective, you know, ensuring that in most of our locations, and Ray can speak to Alaska, but most of our locations, the folks that are going to help with assistance with wheelchairs, getting through the airport, getting through TSA, in-planing and deplaning assistance, a lot of those employees are actual contractors and vendors. And so the more notice that we have, the better we can plan. And believe me, we use all of that data from all of the folks who have given us advance notice in the past. That really helps us know what to expect when a plane arrives or when a plane's getting ready to take off. It's just really, really key. And certainly we can help someone at the last minute, but really that advance notice is just it goes a long way for helping us help you.
Yeah, and I would use the example of a restaurant to where maybe 2,000 people are going to eat at a restaurant one evening, but only 500 people make a reservation. And then we don't really know how many people are going to show up. Are 2,000 people going to show? So to Dallas's point, we spend a lot of time looking and projecting and estimating how many people we're going to show by day of week and by hour and by flight. And the more you can partner with us in terms of us knowing who's coming out that day, really helps minimize the risk that we're going to miss somebody.
So when you're talking about sort of preparation and having the right staffing in place, that kind of leads naturally into the thought of staff training and how the needs of the disability community are incorporated into how you approach that and kind of what you do at the air carrier level. And can you share with us a little bit about how you incorporate the needs of the community of passengers who fly with disabilities into your overall programs and then your staff training efforts?
Well, first of all, carriers are required, and we want to be ensuring that our employees at every single touch point in every work group are trained to proficiency in accessibility. So there might be some different training depending on the work group. A reservations agent will have heavier emphasis on the reservation and making sure all your requirements are put into your reservation record, so we deliver on the services you need. A ramp service individual will get a different set of training. We all get basic etiquette and how to make sure we're talking properly and communicating well in accordance with accessibility. But the ramp service agent will be more focused, I believe, on the power chair and the scooters and how we're safely transporting them on and off the plane.
Yeah, and one of the things that we do every year, and I spend a half a day to a day attending this event where we bring in all of our trainers from the field, and they come in and we're kind of training the trainer day to get them ready for the next disability awareness training cycle the following year. And it's really great because not only do they get a refresher on all of the services that we provide and all of the things that we're required to provide, but we also incorporate a different topic, a hot topic or theme to that training as well. And so we bring in people from different advocacy groups to come in and spend some time talking to the trainers. And so sort of organically, they're going back out into the field and they're sharing this anecdotal knowledge that they've had by having FaceTime with different advocacy organizations. And it just creates a more solid understanding from every single level of our employees as to what really needs to go on out there and how we can better serve our customers.
And we do something similar. We're not the size of Southwest, but we have different approaches that we're doing essentially the same thing. And it's all about making personal connections with our employees and personal connections with our guests. And interestingly enough, everybody who works at Alaska and Southwest, they have personal connections with people with disabilities too. One example that we do at Alaska is we have one of our ramp service employees who uses the power chair, and he comes out to all the flight attendant initial classes, and he spends a few hours with them, actually talking with them about his day, how long it takes him to prepare to get up in the morning. The flight attendants actually spend a day in a manual chair during the course of their 5 weeks of initial training. And that's not the important part. The important part is they convey their perceptions about spending a day in a wheelchair, as opposed to Gary that says, here's what my life and what my day looks like when I use a power chair. And that's all about getting personal connections, getting people connected.
So that brings up a really, I think, important point to the community that relies on assistive devices and wheelchairs. And one of the other findings from our survey, we heard a lot about this, of course, anecdotally, and there have been news stories and a lot of conversation around this. But we found that in the survey of our community that there were a significant number of passengers who had experienced damage to their wheelchairs in flight. And we know, and as you also know, damaging the wheelchair in flight can prevent someone from being able to get around and being able to go about their daily life and kind of maintain their health and independence. So that's a significant challenge that I know you're aware of, but would like to talk a little bit about how you're addressing that in your current practices at your airlines and then kind of also just within the industry at large.
I think on an individual airline basis, the ultimate thing here is that we never want to damage a device. It's no good for our customer, absolutely, and it's no good for us as a carrier. And so we work really hard to maintain a really robust reporting cycle on the types of damage that are happening, what the root causes are, what our vendors to when they unfortunately have to go do a repair, what they're reporting back to us on the types of damage that we're seeing. So it's a really important thing from just an overall guest experience, customer experience piece, but it's also an important thing for us as an industry to focus on. And I know that we're working on some things to hopefully improve the quality of devices and help the manufacturers of these devices look for ways to make them more durable and more suited for transport on an airplane.
Yeah, and I think I would add to that we investigate, just like Southwest, we investigate every chair that gets damaged to look at the root cause and a corrective action. It's not unusual. For example, about a month ago, we had basically a forum where we brought two guests come in and share their experiences directly with our frontline people and our policymakers to make that a really nice, tight, and meaningful emotional connection. And then there's other things that we can look at where they're basically, I would call them like things that we can do to control the situation to reduce the potential that a chair is going to get damaged. And very simple things like if when you're buying a ticket and you know the cargo pit dimensions and the size of your chair, we can have that conversation, say, is your chair going to fit? Are there any specialized tools that might be needed that we're not familiar with or may not have in sight? Might you be able to bring those tools along with you? Do you know your chair? Are there things about your chair that you can convey with us, especially when you get out to the gate area and we start talking about loading your chair, that would help us be aware of any areas that might be prone to damage or that can be removed and taken on board? And then just a reminder, anything that you can take off your chair to reduce the size of the chair, that's what we would call assistive devices that we don't charge for those items if you were to put them in a bag solely with those items and bring them on board. So that's probably an important thing to mention. You can help us when you're traveling reduce the risk of power chair damage.
So to that point, though, a lot of people traveling with these sorts of devices don't necessarily have within their own capabilities the ability to break down a chair or to take pieces apart or to actually make it a smaller device. Is that something that they can seek assistance for?
Yeah, I would add there are certain things like on our website, and I believe most carrier websites will have some sort of a downloadable form. And we have one at Alaska, and I think Dallas, Southwest has one as well. And that form asks the types of information that we really need. What's the weight of the chair? What's the overall dimension of the chair? Does it have a non-spillable battery? All those types of things, we just recommend that get downloaded and get affixed to the chair. So you could tape it on, you could provide it when you travel to our ramp staff or the gate staff. That's a very simple thing that we think could be done in advance to collect that information. And then we do have some guests that laminate parts of the manual that includes how the breakdown occurs, and they laminate it and they just affix it to the chair. And these are road warriors. They're people who are traveling a lot, so yeah. they've experienced, they know how to make things better. So they just do that for us.
Yeah, this is something that we would really like to do more often at the gate area. So if you let us know that, this piece of my chair can be removed and I'd like to take it in the cabin, but I need some help doing that, our employees are more than willing to help do that, because no single employee ever wants to be the one to tell someone, I'm so sorry we damaged your chair. So we will take the time to do that as long as we have the tools available that are needed. So where Ray's making the point, if you have any sort of specialized tools that you would want us to use to, perhaps detach something from the chair so that you can take it on board with you, that's always the best policy is let us know. And if you're at the gate early, we want to help you do that. And we'll send somebody up from the ramp and they'll sit there and they'll work through that with you. They're not going to take the chair out of your sight and go try to take parts off of it. They want to have a conversation about how to best handle that.
So I think that the conversation about kind of handling of wheelchairs and how that process takes place, that really kind of segues into something we're going to talk about a little bit later, which is the idea of kind of strapping down wheelchairs or being able to stay in your wheelchair during flight. And the way we've kind of wanted to organize the conversation today is talking about the realities of traveling today and then looking at some of the future possibilities more later in the conversation. So for those of you who are listening to the webinar, we are going to be circling back and having a robust conversation about the idea of staying in wheelchairs in flight. And one of the other things I wanted to talk about that we saw on the Accessible Air Travel Survey that we conducted was also that there are a lot of challenges around individuals with disabilities getting the assistance they need in the airport, transferring on and off planes, some of the delays associated with that or challenges associated with that. And just wanted to see if I could ask you to talk a little bit about kind of what you see happening in that space, or what your efforts are to try to improve or standardize the ability of passengers to get assistance.
One of the things that we really pay attention to at Southwest is the timing of all of that. So we have reports available that show how long it took a wheelchair attendant, for instance, to get to a flight to assist somebody off the plane or onto the plane. So we really work hard on that, and we're looking forward to, the potential down the road. And I know we're probably going to talk about this a little bit later, but emerging technologies that can help us be more prepared and be more connected to be able to make those things happen.
So let's look a little bit ahead to kind of some of the future considerations for air travel, and talking about planning and implementing new ideas and approaches. And some of the things I know that we've talked about in our other conversations have been some newer emerging technologies that you're looking toward as being hopefully very feasible opportunities to increase access to air travel. And I think that for the folks who are listening today, they'd be really interested in hearing a little bit more about some of the innovative strategies that you're exploring. If you wouldn't mind giving us some information about that.
Sure. I think one thing I'd mention at Alaska, and this is just this is occurring throughout the industry, but at Alaska we now have tablets that our flight attendants or pilots and customer service agents, and it's working down to the ramp as well. So they have mobile tablets where they can receive and push information. They have access to manual information for policies and procedures. And this doesn't sound really glamorous, but it is really, really helpful for an agent to sit there and pull up a picture of a device, look at information, share that information in a real-time way, in addition to communicate information downline too. So I would say just the emerging technology of the mobile tablets for our employees has been really, really a game changer for us, and we see much more doing that. We're actually pushing training now out via the mobile devices, and we can do it on a quarterly basis instead of an annual basis because it's so easy to get that content pushed. And we can see who's reading it, and we can nudge people that need to make sure that they've gone through the training, maybe didn't get to it. So that's just one example that I would like to make that's really, I believe, is going to make a meaningful difference.
Yeah, and we have similar programs in place, and it's really been such a benefit. And also, to me, one of the game changers as well is not only for our employees, but the vendor employees that we use to transport wheelchairs and that sort of thing. They're using tablet technology now, and it's evolved so much, even just in the last 3 years. It's great because now we can actually see the journey that a customer takes when they're deplaning, going to the baggage claim, or just the amount of time that it took from that vendor employee leaving the dispatch area to get over to the gate and help somebody off the plane. So we can see that data in real time, and it paints a much broader, much better picture, and we can report it down to the individual airport level, the individual gate level, and it's a really good litmus test for how well we're performing. But I think there's a lot of other things, as technology keeps evolving. I think I used the term when we were discussing this earlier. We live in the Internet of Things now. Everything is connected. Our passengers are very connected, and our employees are very connected. So I think just any of those emerging technologies, Bluetooth, for instance, that we could use to perhaps call wheelchairs from a gate, or to track a wheelchair, track somebody's device that's been checked on an aircraft. All of these different things, as they become more prevalent in normal everyday life, they also become much, much easier to incorporate into our operations.
Yeah, and right along those same lines, so we have the tablet technology now, and now it's just a matter of building apps that reside on those tablets. And so there's a lot of robust discussions within the groups, including ourselves, saying we want accessibility apps. We want to be able to do this, or provide a service that allows that. With the vendors, surveys, you just have a service delivered to you from one of our service providers, and we can get more real-time feedback as to whether that went well or not, just like a Uber type of rating. And then the other piece is just wayfinding. I think will help everybody. And once again, this is something that every traveler wants access to, and so we see a marketing perspective of It's something that we can really sink our teeth into because we know it's going to happen, and we just need, in an inclusive way, make sure that wayfinding for people with disabilities is included into that. And I see that happening over the next couple of years.
Yeah, and speaking of inclusion, technology is advancing at such a rapid rate. All of our airlines have such major projects underway all the time that are related to technology and all of that change. So it makes it that much easier for us to look for opportunities to sort of bake accessibility into that. And so, accessibility really becomes more of a programmatic approach as opposed to just being individual projects. And doing it that way allows us to create more sustainability and more robust accessible programs.
Yeah, and then I don't think I didn't clarify it earlier, when we're asking information that you need when you travel, we're not asking you to tell us what your disability is. We're asking you to help share with us what services you need. So that could be, I need assistance with my chair, I need assistance on and off the plane. We're not going so invasive to say we need to know about your disability. I think I just want to call that out.
I think that's helpful. And another thing I did want to also circle back on, as you just did with that point, is when we were talking about wheelchair and scooter damage, there is a new regulation on the books that will require reporting of that. And I know we've talked a little bit about that. I think it might be interesting to the folks to hear a little bit of discussion around how that will kind of help them in terms of travel planning and looking at the realities of wheelchair and scooter damage in flight.
Sure. So the Department of Transportation issued a new regulation last year that will require in January of 2019 that all U.S. air carriers report not only the number of wheelchairs that they transport, but also the number of wheelchairs that are damaged. And that information will be reported publicly through what's called the Air Travel Consumer Report that the Department of Transportation publishes every month. So once that program gets up and running and all the carriers are reporting that information to the Department of Transportation on a monthly basis, passengers will be able to look at that report, look and see who's carrying wheelchairs, how they're doing as far as damage, and make better decisions on who they want to travel with.
So it sounds like there's really a lot happening currently, but also in a forward-looking sense in regard to access to air travel. And we're going to be talking a little bit more about some of those other items, including access to lavatories in flight, which we know is a big issue for passengers traveling with disabilities. But before we get to that, I do want to touch on this concept of passengers being able to remain in their wheelchairs during flight. And this is a concept that's important to MDA and to the neuromuscular disease community and to the disability community at large. The idea of being able to remain in your wheelchair, some folks call it kind of strapping down. There's a lot of momentum behind the concept. In both the House and the Senate, FAA reauthorization bills contain provisions that would study this as a concept. And so I think it would be really interesting to everyone who's listening today to hear your views on that kind of as an approach and have some discussion around that.
Well, so this is Doug at Airlines for America. We support the studies that are in the legislation. We think it's interesting that we support the FAA and the government studying strapping down wheelchairs on the interior of aircraft for air travel. I think that's something that needs to include a lot of stakeholders. Obviously, it would need to include the disability community. It would need to include the aircraft manufacturers, include the airlines, and I think it's something that we should all come together and take a closer look at and see what the results are.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And from Southwest perspective, we're interested to see how the study works, and we support the study. This is one of those things that I know that would be such a huge benefit for the disability community and in particular the neuromuscular disability community. And we want to just make sure that if we're able to do this, we do it right. Because air travel in itself is inherently there is a safety aspect, and so we want to make sure that all of the studies are fully vetted out. We're able to deliver a great product so that it's a seamless experience if and when we're able to do that. We're particularly interested in seeing how that plays out.
yeah, we're in the same, but we are interested in seeing how this goes and what we can do to participate.
So I think it's really interesting. It sounds like there's definitely support and interest in having the concept vetted and having the stakeholders that need to be at the table looking at that in sort of a controlled way to see kind of what the feasibility and opportunity would be there, which I think is probably very welcome for the folks who are interested in accessible air travel to hear, because we don't always get a chance to hear from you directly, kind of what your thoughts are on things of this nature.
We've kind of learned through this process short term, too, that I think one of the asks that, at least at Alaska, we haven't spent as much time on is distance. How far is it from the ticket counter to the gate? How far is it once you get on board the plane? Is it 100 feet or 120 feet back to your seat? So we're starting to think that through as to what that might look like for somebody who maybe has a neuromuscular disease where your condition is changing. You might be able to walk at some point, but how far is that distance? And airports are large, and you have to walk a long way. So we're starting to think more along those lines too.
So what would you say? I mean, this is you might have already touched on it in our other conversation points, but what would you say are the biggest or the most important factors that would impact greater access to air travel in the future? I heard talk about technology and kind of looking at processes, but is there anything that kind of jumps out outside of maybe what we've already touched on or something we've talked about that you would want to build out a little bit?
Well, to me, it's knowing exactly what the guest needs to have a great trip, and being able to know that in advance, but also if the conditions change is real time, that you could kind of on the fly make an adaptation, and communicating that to the people in the airport or on the airplane that are the best positioned at that time to help you with your needs. And we've never been able to do that when you don't have a dynamic kind of ability to communicate guest to guest or airline to guest. But I see us getting there over the next few years to where we can really understand what every individual guest needs are, and then we can prioritize that.
I think one of the biggest factors really is collaboration among the air carriers and the advocacy groups, and making sure that things like we're doing today, where we're having these conversations and we're approaching things in a collaborative effort, will really sort of move the needle on accessibility in the future. We know that the disability community is growing, and we also know that there are many, many more folks who are wanting to get out there and travel, and that's something that we want to deliver on. So we really appreciate that opportunity to be able to have those conversations.
So let me ask you this. I think that we have a lot of questions here. So what I think we might do is pivot just a couple of minutes early to answering some of these questions, so we can make sure we can get in as many as possible. So I'm going to go ahead, for those of you who are participating on the webinar, I'm just going to start reading out questions as we've received them, and we'll look forward to having our colleagues here share their thoughts with us on these. And these really appear, at least at first glance, to run a pretty wide spectrum of things. So if you have submitted a question, stay tuned, and we will get to as many as we can. So one question is there a way that a person who is flying with a caregiver can change the name of the caregiver on the ticket in case the original caregiver cannot make it?
Best way to probably answer this is every carrier has policies and procedures related, or policies related to ticket purchasing. But when somebody calls and says, here's my unique circumstance, and my caregiver that I originally planned to travel with is not able to travel, and I need to be traveling with somebody else, I would just ask that if you can convey that as early on as you become aware of it, we can help evaluate that, and on a case-by-case basis, we would make decisions. I would if I got a call like that, I would make the exception. I would call this an exception to policy. But just, as soon as you become aware of that, go ahead and reach out to us either through a contact us page on the website or a phone call and tell us what's going on. And I believe in most cases carriers are going to make an exception like that. They're not going to question that. Dallas?
Yeah, I agree with Ray, and we would approach it the same way. I mean, it comes down to making an exception to the ticketing policy. And so that kind of goes back to what we talked about at the very beginning of the webinar as well, about educating yourself about each individual carrier's policies and that sort of thing, because it's important for you to know, hey, I need to make this change, so am I going to need to ask the carrier to make an exception? And like Ray's saying, the earlier that we can do that, the better, because then you're not worrying about that on the day of travel.
And so would the best way for someone who has a request of that nature to get to the right person, would it be to go through reservations, to go through a special point of contact, or what would be your guidance for folks?
I would typically say the area in which you're kind of asking about, and in this case you're talking about ticketing and purchasing and the reservation, I would suggest going to reservations to ask that type of thing. But the other areas within the company, if we got that request, we would look at that as well.
Yeah, I agree, and all carriers accept email as well via their contact us link, so that's a really good way to make sure that your request gets to the right place. But the first point of contact usually is going to be that 1-800 number, and then they're going to work with you to get you where you need to go.
And many carriers are having social features within their website functions as well. So you might go Facebook or Twitter too might be a way to do that.
Great. And this next question, this is interesting because it really does go to what other things we saw in our survey results, having to do with the challenges of transferring in and out of seats, especially with a neuromuscular disease where you may have all extremity weakness or a disability that prevents you from being able to move yourself easily from seat to seat. And the question is, have the airlines ever thought about making seats more suitable for people with disabilities?
I would say yes. I mean, we're constantly looking what our customer base is telling us about the comfort of the seat, the size of the seat. We work with our interiors department a lot, the engineering interiors group, to look to see what we can do in terms of making the seat more comfortable.
Yeah, and that's one of the interesting things about this business is, when you go buy an airplane from Boeing or Airbus in those cases are not manufacturing the seat that goes in the airplane. And so all of the various interior manufacturers all have in-house engineers, and most of them have folks on staff who have accessibility backgrounds. And they're trying to make all of those products better. So it's one of those things that, success builds on success, and as we progress, the seats get better and better. But yeah, absolutely, that's something that we take into consideration when we're designing a new interior.
So one of the things that's been interesting through this generally, but particularly looking at access, is the amount of time it takes for changes to be implemented, to be carried out, particularly when we're talking about changes within the structure of an airplane or the configuration of the cabin. And so I wonder if, is there an expected kind of lag time? If you've got these folks who are focusing on this and really looking at this, maybe you could talk a little bit about the time that takes from, having an idea or identifying a way to make something more accessible to being able to actually execute that within the plane design itself.
I guess I would add, if you could differentiate, or if we could differentiate between a policy, because we have much more ability to change a policy as opposed to changing the configuration of a seat. Like if we just want to say we want to remove the seat and put a different type of seat in there, that's changing the aircraft, and that's something that's approved by the FAA. It's designed. These seats are tested rigorously to make sure that they're safe. That would take a much longer period of time to make a change like that. But if we want to say we want to allow and make an exception or make a policy to let people do things differently within the cabin, that's not unusual that we would do that. Or an orthopedic positioning device would be an example of something that we can get FAA approval if it gets approved, and then somebody can travel with that. Alice, I don't know if you...
Yeah, just, to give you an example, if an airline decides to change the look and feel of their aircraft interior, that can be years just in the ideation phase of getting that all right and making sure that it's a cohesive product and everything meets the FAA certification and everything. And then the time frame to roll it out can be a really long time as well, because the airplanes have to come into the hangar and be there sometimes for days and weeks to get all of that done. So I agree with Ray. It's much easier from our standpoint to work through policy changes, but then kind of in the background try to influence those other changes along the way that are more long-term in nature.
And another question that's come in is, are there any plans to designate a few rows in the front of the plane for passengers with disabilities? And I think, just to build this question out a little bit, I think part of the consideration specifically for the neuromuscular disease community is that everyone living with a neuromuscular disease doesn't necessarily rely on a wheelchair. For a lot of folks, distance is a key consideration, or changes of level, or having to change, having to get over a large gap or a space, for example, having to take a wide step. And so in regard to this question, has there been conversation around designating rows in the front for individuals with disabilities?
I would probably add that if somebody's traveling with a fused or immobilized leg or a service animal, the requirements are already out there today that to allow the bulkhead row in the class of service that you've ticketed for. And I think it's probably important during the travel decision phase to look at the carrier you're flying with and the configuration of that compartment, because some carriers have no first class, other carriers have first class and coach, and then some carriers have first class and they have a premium class cabin, and then they have a coach. So that helps you make a decision how far forward you want to sit, if it's a matter of how far you want to sit as close to the front of the airplane. But an individual with disability can select any seat that's available within that class of service that best accommodates their disability, and we will give that to them.
So it sounds like right now the seats that are reserved or able to be set aside for a passenger with a disability are the bulkhead seats. Is that accurate, or are those are kind of held for that purpose? Or
it's really going to depend on each carrier and how they do things, because there's various methodologies of assigning seats and seat selection and all of that. Southwest Airlines, for example, we only operate a single class of service. So every seat in our cabin is the same. And so by doing that, we actually don't assign seats. So we're able to do things a little differently, where we allow people who need a specific seat on the airplane to pre-board before everybody else, and they're able to go on and go ahead and select the seat that best suits their needs, with the exception of the exit row, because there's some FAA implications there.
okay.
Yeah, and you just picked one thing I think it's important to share with everybody is when you're hearing a pre-boarding announcement, there will be a pre-boarding announcement that includes a piece that says if you need a little extra time or assistance to board the airplane. That's really for folks who do need a little extra time and assistance. I would encourage people when they get out to the gate to present themselves and say, hey, I'm here, I'm going to need a little extra time. And that's, once again, it's sharing what you need to best accommodate your travel experience at every touch point, whether it be in reservations, at the ticket counter, out of the gate. You don't have to do that, but if you help self-disclose a little bit, it really helps us to keep an eye out for you and make sure you're getting that service.
Yeah, that's a great point, because on a carrier that would assign seats, even, if you've done your research online and you've kind of picked out, I think this is where I need to sit. If you're on there early and for some reason that doesn't work for you, it's much easier for the carrier to help change that accommodation for you before everybody else starts getting on and the boarding process starts taking place.
There could be a seat that wasn't available at the time, or somebody who took a different flight and all of a sudden a seat's available that wasn't, maybe during the booking process.
But I think a lot of it goes back to really, researching those airplane layouts, and all of the carriers, particularly those that assign seats, have seat maps available online, but then there's also vast amounts of resources online for airplane seat maps by carrier and that sort of thing. So you can really do a lot of research.
The next question here is it's pretty specific, talking about portable oxygen. Are the airlines allowing passengers to board with a portable oxygen concentrator? Can they use them in flight? And if not, how is oxygen provided?
Yes, it's got much easier for travelers using oxygen concentrators today, and actually our airline staff, because there is a list of approved devices that we have in our manuals, and then if they're not, if they're one of these older devices that are on this list, you're good to go. And then all the new devices coming out today have labeling that says approved for air travel. So the answer is yes. If you have one of these devices that's on this list approved by the FAA, and it's either on the grandfathered list or it's on a label, you're going to be able to travel with that. Doug, I don't know if you want to jump in here.
And you'll be able to use it during the flight. So you not only will be able to take it, but you'll be able to use it on the flight. And there are, as Ray said, I think there are 20, 25 or 27 devices that have been approved by the FAA already. And then other devices need to have a special label that say that they're approved for air travel. But I think the industry view is that just about all portable oxygen concentrators are approved for travel. Just make sure before you travel that it is.
And I would add in, it's really important to check with your carrier, but just make sure there are certain things that you're going to need if you're traveling with one of these. Having battery life that's equal to 150% of the flight time. So, if the weather's bad where you're going to land and the airplane needs to circle for a little bit, that makes sure that you're going to be able to keep using your device while you're in the air. And then also check with your carrier about where those devices need to be stowed if you're using them during the flight, because they typically are going to need to go under the seat in front of you. And because of the oxygen hose, the nasal cannula, you want that toward the outside of the airplane, so on the window side, so it's not a tripping hazard for anybody trying to get in and out of the seat.
Yeah. And then the other thing is, when oxygen concentrators first came out, it was primarily, in my view, people that could afford to pay for them. So they really did understand their own oxygen concentrator. But there's a big industry now in terms of rentals of the portable oxygen concentrators, and we're seeing more people flying that are not familiar with their portable oxygen concentrator. Maybe they go on a trip and it's the first time they've had it, and maybe they picked it up the night before. So, I would just bluntly kind of say, travelers have rights but have responsibilities, and I would make sure you ensure that the batteries are charged up, that you have sufficient batteries, and you know how to operate that device, because our flight crews won't be versed in that.
Yeah, it's really important to understand all of the different alarms and settings, and making sure that you've discussed with your physician what the flow rate needs to be. We all, most of the carriers provide on our websites our cabin altitude pressure, so it's important that your doctor knows to what level the cabin's going to be pressurized, so that way they can give you the right flow rate for the device. So there's a lot of different things, and we make that available on our website.
So I'm going to ask a couple of more of these questions and then get into a little bit of discussion around accessible lavatories, because we've had a lot of questions come in about that, and we know that that's really important to our community. But I do want to cover a couple of more of these before we get into the accessible lavatories, and there's also some follow-up questions about staying in wheelchairs during flight that folks would like a little bit of elaboration on. But first, let me just go to this one quickly. Is there an easier way for individuals who travel alone with their dogs to find out where the dog relief area is, as most airport personnel do not know?
I think that's a really good question. And the thing I would suggest is many carrier websites, we have a list of the service animal relief areas at the airports that we serve. But typically what we do is we have a matrix and we link off to the airport site. So that means we're getting that location from the airport. And in recent years, the airports, in my view, have gotten much better in terms of having places on their website that you can find where the accessible relief areas. Often there are pictures, there are maps on how you can get to them. And like I mentioned with the portable tablets now, not only for the airlines, but for the airports that have volunteers that are out there working, they have a better concept on where these are. So my first thought would be look at the airport website, look at the carrier website. I have an app that I downloaded that has the locations of service animal relief areas as well, so you can find those. Really? Just make sure it's updated, because the one I have looks a little out of date. Then the other thing, maybe Dallas, you could talk to about the changes in the reg and the new enhancements.
Sure, yeah. There's some requirements now for airport operators to ensure that their service animal relief areas on the secure side of the airport, meaning the gate side. So traditionally, a lot of the airports, if you're traveling with your service animal and you're on a connection, it's really unfortunate because you have to go outside of security and then spend the time coming back through. And that can be a very, very stressful experience based on connection times and that sort of thing. So now that we're seeing more of these areas being created, even some of the airports are converting old smoking lounges. They're going and gutting these things and converting them into these great animal relief areas. It becomes much easier for airport personnel and our own employees to give directions to get there, because they're not directing you all the way outside the airport. It's just down the hall.
Yeah, it's not unusual. You'll see a room with AstroTurf with little sprinklers that pop up, and you have the garbage cans, and they're well signed. And compared to the old days when the rule first came out, it wasn't like that, but we're seeing a vast improvement, in my opinion, the areas out there.
So one question that's just come in reads, the discussion of staying in one's wheelchair during the flight was very vague. Why is it currently not possible to stay in your wheelchair? What are the safety issues that were mentioned? And what is being done to address these barriers? And I know that's something that you can easily fill out a little bit for us. So.
Sure. So every seat that goes into an airplane has to meet very specific seat testing requirements. They call it the 16G rule, which means that every aircraft seat has to be able to withstand 16 Gs of force. And the FAA has spent quite a bit of time developing these standards. They enforce them very strictly. So to the extent that folks are interested in replacing that standardized seat with a wheelchair that would be strapped down, there would have to be, an FAA safety analysis of whether the strapping down of that seat could also meet the current safety standards for the standardized aircraft seat. And, that's something that the agency really has to take a closer look at.
And Doug, would that vary by wheelchair?
It could. I mean, I think, it's not going to be an easy study, but again, it's something that we support. We support studying, seeing where it comes out. But I can tell you that these aircraft certification standards are pretty well enforced by the government. And so we're happy that everyone is going to take a closer look at this.
So I think since we only have about 5 minutes left, I want to make sure that we spend a little bit of time on accessible lavatories, because again, we know that that's a really important issue for our community, and quite a few questions have come in during the process of our conversation also about accessibility to lavatories. Everything from wondering if any of your airlines have requested a competitive bid for aircraft that have wheelchair accessible bathrooms with room for a caregiver. We've had a question about asking specifically how will people get in and out of lavatories, and there's been a lot of work that's been done around this just in the last 12 months, and so I think that it's important to make sure and kind of give an overview of what that work is and what the future of access to lavatories looks like in flight. So I'll turn that over to you to kind of give a high-level overview, but just to kind of get the conversation started, there was a 6-month regulatory negotiation process that went on in 2016 with a lot of those of us who are here in the room participating in that, along with folks, a nice representation of individuals from regulatory agencies, industry, designer manufacturers, advocacy organizations, individuals living with disabilities, kind of coming together and looking at what some of the specific challenges were. And one of those issues that was addressed in that 6-month process was access to lavatories for single-aisle aircraft. So currently for dual-aisle aircraft, there are already rules and regulations in place that include, and correct me if I misspeak here, but I believe one accessible lavatory that meets this standard that's being posed in the questions that we're seeing coming in. But that single-aisle aircraft at that time did not fall under those same rules and regulations. And so the idea was to revisit that and see if there might be a way that this diverse stakeholder community could come together and agree on what a feasible approach would be to implement greater accessibility to lavatories on single-aisle aircraft. And so I'll turn that over to our panelists to talk a little bit more about, but we will not have time to get into great detail about that process today. But what I would ask all of you who are listening to do, who are interested in that particularly and would like to take a deeper dive into that information, to visit MDA's Accessible Air Travel Resource Center, where we have information there and where we will continue to maintain and update information about that. And after this webinar, we'll be putting a blog out that will also be linked to that landing page where you can continue to find additional information. But having said that, I want to take advantage of the resources we have here in the room to touch on that process a little bit and what folks can expect to see coming in the future on that regard.
Thanks, Kristen. So I think, the negotiated rulemaking that took place last year was highly successful, and for the first time ever, the airlines agreed, along with the aircraft manufacturers and DOT and the advocacy groups, that yes, there should be accessible lavatories on single-aisle aircraft. Now, that's going to be something that takes some time, as we talked about earlier, because the aircraft cycle, getting new aircraft into the cycle of purchasing and fixing the interiors will take some time. So it will be, it'll apply to new aircraft that are developed within the industry, and it'll be, you know, sometime before that comes into being. But we also addressed some shorter-term accommodations as well, which include such things as additional crew member training, working on a new aisle wheelchair that would go on the aircraft. So there are a number of items that we've agreed to. There is an agreement out there from the negotiated rulemaking, and the next step will be for the Department of Transportation to move forward on that regulation, and we all look forward to commenting on that regulation.
And we will certainly, this is Kristen with MDA, we'll be keeping you apprised of how that process is moving forward and keeping you informed along the way, and look forward to continuing to work with our colleagues here in the room as well as all the other stakeholders in the accessible air travel space. And appreciate all of your interest in this, and appreciate everyone's time today for joining us, and to our guests for being part of this conversation and being part of the solution. So thank you all very much, and we look forward to continuing to work together.
Thank you. Thank you.